Today I will tell you a famous ghost story of a restaurant in Guangzhou, China. Since the opening day, the restaurant's business was very prosperous. It was profitable, and diners from many places near and far came there more and more. This restaurant was a wooden structure with 3 floors. It has undergone many repairs so far over 200 years. This incident happened in 1985. It was said that a newlywed couple booked a party at the restaurant to hold their wedding. The restaurant was also very attentive. They also invited a very lively drum and trumpet band to join the wedding fun. Guests and friends came to congratulate and sat at dozens of tables. Everyone clapped, cheered, and shouted with excitement to celebrate the happiness of the young couple together. Friends and relatives all came to celebrate with their families. They took turns toasting the newlyweds and hoping that the couple would always be happy. At the party there was a little girl among the guests. Her face did not look very happy. She seemed to have encountered something. It seemed that the little girl smelled the burning smell of something, so she told the adults at the table, as well as her mother. But her mother said that she didn't smell any burning there. People continued to ignore the girl because it didn't smell any burning like she said. It continues to stand up to celebrate with everyone. The little girl who told everyone before that she smelled burning now said that she saw smoke coming out of her house. The fire flared up fiercely. It was already red in the whole area. People didn't seem to feel the danger approaching. The fire might have burned everything. It spread at dizzying speed. It spread it without stopping. It burned quickly and burned all the curtains. The fire continued to burn and consume everything it passed by. It became more and more intense, but people still didn't seem to know that this was happening. The restaurant was entirely a structure built of wood, so the fire could easily be fought in an instant. It wasn't until the guests at the party began to smell the smoke that they noticed the fire was spreading to every corner, and that everything and everyone was on fire. They began to run up the stairs desperately. They screamed, one running on top of the other to find a way to escape. In the thick smoke, men, women, and children ran. They ran after their survival instincts, trying to find every opportunity to find a way to live. The restaurant stairs leading down were steep and narrow. It couldn't hold everyone if they jostled each other up, and all ran down to try to get out. Before going down the stairs, flames rose from the lower floor. It seemed to want to block all exits so that it could burn everyone, including humans. Everyone seemed to want to go back up the stairs because the fire in front of them had almost burned part of their bodies. There were screams and a panic that began to ring. The guests cried out in despair, and the heat of the fire was terrible. Many people were engulfed in flames. They had no way out. They shouted as much as they could, but the fire swallowed them whole. Among the guests who could not escape, there was a man whose whole body was on fire. He rushed to the window. The others had the same fate as him. Their whole bodies were on fire. The flames completely consumed them all, and everyone rushed to the windows. Unable to withstand the terrifying heat of the fire, those who burned in the night glowed like red torches, one by one falling from the 3rd floor to the ground. Passers-by who saw the terrible scene also panicked and wanted to find a way to rescue them, but were helpless because the fire was just too big. The whole building was engulfed in flames. Not a corner was without fire. The fire completely consumed everything from plates to people. Firefighters spent hours trying to put out the flames as quickly as possible, but the flames were too big to save anyone's life. When the fire was completely extinguished, the restaurant, which was originally magnificent, was now only a pile of ashes. Almost everything was in ruins. All were burned by the fire. Looking at this place then was no different from places that had been abandoned for many years, surrounded by the smell of burning corpses. Dozens of people were also burned to death. Bodies were scattered on the stairs, and wedding guests were then only burned skeletons. Everyone remained the same as they were consumed by the flames. Faces were trying to scream for help. They stretched out their arms to wait for help. On the 7th night since the terrible fire broke out, the flow of people was still passing by. As usual, the restaurant then looked extremely dilapidated. Some neighbors lived near the area next to the restaurant, and they all heard the sound of drums and trumpets shaking the quiet area. The sound was getting closer and closer. The closer it got, the louder the sound, as if some event was about to happen. That shrill sound came from the window. Everyone thought it was the house where the wedding was held, but there was no way that a family could hold a wedding at such a late night. The sound of drums and trumpets resounded deafeningly, making everyone unable to sleep. Many people got up and opened their windows to look outside to see what was going on. And they were extremely surprised when for the first time in their lives they saw such a strange sight with their own eyes. They saw a very large group of people, young and old. All were full. In the middle was a red flower palanquin. They sang while going to the restaurant where the fire broke out. All of them stopped in front of the restaurant, but these people were silent. No one uttered a word, unlike the excitement from before. After a while, suddenly everyone started to cry loudly. Young and old, everyone was screaming and crying. Something black, as if it were liquid flowing out from the lock of the people's eyes, which was scary. The sound of crying went straight to the eardrums. That made everyone feel uncomfortable. Those who mourned, their eyes were black. People didn't dare to listen to these sounds. They all closed the doors at the same time so they didn't have to hear anything about this devil's cry. The people who accompanied the flower float stood in front of the restaurant and cried all night. The crying echoed, and everyone could hear. This continued until the sun rose the next day. The sun gradually illuminated all things. The glittering rays gradually appeared. All of the people from last night disappeared, and that night the first 7 people burned to death in the restaurant where the people sang. After that, the investors had to renovate the burned restaurant to restore what the fire had caused. During the renovation, there was a carpenter who encountered something strange. Everyone who was involved in the rebuilding of the restaurant was present. The carpenter was just doing his job when he suddenly stopped. He looked very scary. There was something very unusual about him. He was like a lost soul. People called him, but he didn't hear them. It was like someone was hypnotizing him. As he slowly started walking straight to the window. Colleagues did not even react in time and tried to call him back, but he completely lost his mind. He jumped out of the window to the bottom. He fell and died on the spot, and everyone knew then that he had no reason to commit suicide. A few days after that suicide, another worker suddenly climbed onto the table in the middle of the working day. It was like he was being controlled by someone. He sang Cantonese opera. While he was from another region, he couldn't even understand Cantonese opera. They said he was probably harassed by some spirit that died in the fire. After multiple attempts, the restaurant was rebuilt, but in the end, it was still demolished in 2006. Strange things about it have been handed down to this day. This is what happened to my friend. Even when I thought about that, I was still terrified of it, and it still haunted me to this day. I was having a relaxing time that night while playing some games. I like to play raids, and this was my only hobby. My work was also quite easy. After I came home from work, I sat at the computer to play a few games to relieve the stress. The evening was my favorite time. I was about to go to war in the game when suddenly my phone rang. It was late at night, and I was curious to who was calling, and late calls really pissed me off. Because I didn't want to miss the game, I didn't want to pick up the phone, but just glance to see who was calling and who was disturbing me at this hour. It was from my good friend. His name was Ben. He grew up with me when we were little, and then we went to the same university again. I reluctantly picked up the phone. I didn't know if it was so urgent that he called me at this late at night, even though he was a close friend, because that was my resting time. Well, as a result, it wasn't my friend Ben. It was someone from the hospital who called from his phone. My mind started to get confused with a lot of thoughts. I quickly went to the hospital, although the person on the phone didn't say what happened to my friend. It was probably very urgent, so I quickly left. I got dressed and ran downstairs. I was really worried about Ben. Maybe he had an accident or something. So he was rushed to the hospital. I called a taxi and asked the driver to take me to the hospital. Fortunately, in the middle of the night, I still could catch a taxi. The car rushed to the hospital. The scene outside was now pitch black. The traffic was also not crowded. There were only a few taxis on the road then. On the way, many people were burning votive papers. I suddenly remembered that today was the day of worshipping the dead soul. On this day, paper money for dead souls was everywhere on the street. When I got to the hospital, I was called in by a nurse and she told me that my friend was in the operating room. She called me after looking at my friend's phone with my phone number. He was taken to the operating room. His condition must have been very serious. I rushed in and asked, "Did he really have an accident? I pray he's okay." Luckily, he seemed to be fine. So I asked him what happened. "Are you okay? What happened to you?" He seemed to have just woken up, and he couldn't remember what happened. The nurse asked me to pay for his hospital bills and needed to rest now. Then I went out with the nurse. On the way, she told me about Ben's condition. The nurse said Ben was brought to the hospital in a very strange and very scared state. A taxi driver took him to the hospital and called the emergency room. At first she thought it was the driver who caused the accident of Ben. Then Ben was screaming in pain. His face was sweaty and pale, and Ben seemed to have no strength left. His belly was distended and swollen like a pregnant woman's. His shirt seemed to have broken all the buttons, and he looked like he had been hit by evil or had eaten something, so he was poisoned. He was given a gastric lavage after the examination. Even the cleaning process took a long time, but fortunately he was brought here in time, or he might have not been saved. The nurse said he spat out a lot of strange things. They didn't know what he ate, but the horrible stench was overwhelming. When I finally understood Ben's condition, I went to the ATM to withdraw money and take it to pay for his hospital bills. When I returned to the hospital room, my friend Ben became more awake. He told me what he remembered, and Ben began to recount. His face was still showing horror. He said that after coming home from work, he and his colleagues went out together to drink. After drinking too much, Ben was not sober. They said goodbye to each other, and Ben seemed to be drunk. He could no longer stand properly. Because the street was dark and he was drunk, Ben quickly wanted to take a taxi home. I didn't know what happened, and I just had to listen to his story. Then Ben's legs started to wobble. He couldn't stand anymore and fell to the ground. Ben was dreamy in his drunkenness. His face was red, and he was surrounded by a bunch of food that rolled from nowhere. Ben saw some apples on the edge of his head. He wasn't awake at the time, so he picked an apple and picked it up. Ben started to put the apple in his mouth. His mouth opened wide to bite the right apple. While he was eating, he felt someone standing next to him. He glanced up. He was still chewing on an apple in his mouth. It was a strange man. He was very tall. The old man angrily glared at Ben as Ben had just committed something terrible. Now Ben looked closely, and he saw that his face was very strange. The man didn't look like a normal person at all. He seemed to be paying attention to the apples. Ben quickly picked up another apple from the ground and gave it to the man. At this moment, the car drove up, its light shining on him, but strangely the car had no intention of rebuilding. More frightened, the car hit the old man, but strangely he suddenly disappeared like smoke. The car also stopped in front of Ben. It almost hit him. The driver poked his head out and howled at Ben. "Hey, you want to die? What the hell are you doing? Get out of the way!" My friend suddenly felt an unbearable stomach ache, and he started to sweat. In pain, he screamed, clutching his stomach and rolling around on the ground. The kind driver put him in the car and took him to the hospital. When I heard him say that he ate something on the ground, I suddenly thought of something. On the way to the hospital, I also saw a lot of people burning things on the side of the road. Today's the day they worship dead people. The apples my friend picked up on the ground were offered to the dead. Most likely, the old man he saw was a ghost. My friend was punished or maybe cursed, and he almost lost his life. Is it true as they say? The dead will always claim their things back. This story happened about 2 years ago. It was the darkest day of my life, and I am still haunted by the events of that year to this day. Because of work and life pressure, I suffered from severe insomnia and mild depression. So much had happened to me, and it made me really tired, and I gradually fell into a deadlock. The doctor prescribed me a lot of medicine and told me to remember to drink the drugs on time, get enough rest, and not stay up late to recover quickly. My boss also fired me because I could not guarantee the company's work. Fortunately, I had a good boyfriend. My boyfriend was always with me. He always supported me in everything. Because of that, I had more motivation to get well quickly. My boyfriend's house was in the city, and I was in the countryside. Part of the pressure also came from our love story. His family didn't accept me because my situation and his were very different. His parents expected him to find a daughter-in-law who was also suitable for his family. Meanwhile, my family was not well off. He said his mother invited me to his house for dinner, but it seemed that his mother didn't like me at all. She invited me to come, perhaps to let me think for myself and withdraw. My boyfriend encouraged and supported me a lot at the time. If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't have made it through what happened. I really wanted to marry him and prepare for a future life with him. However, his family was a big obstacle for me. Maybe I chose the wrong time to meet his parents. While I was suffering from mental problems and my health was declining, I went to see his parents with a tired appearance. The meal that day was rich with many dishes, but I hardly touched my chopsticks. His mother said that he and I were very young, so marriage should be carefully considered. Although his mother didn't say directly, his mother always wanted us to separate. I even thought that I really didn't deserve their son, and I thought he would listen to his parents and leave me soon. On the way home at this time, it was already dark, and there were very few people passing by. He and I went together, but no one said any word to anyone. He reassured me that he would work hard for our future, but I felt that even if he and I got married, life would not be easy. Maybe in the next day or two we should stop seeing each other temporarily. That night I had to take sleeping pills to be able to sleep. As soon as I fell asleep, I was awakened by the vibrating sound of my phone, and it was none other than a text from my boyfriend. As a hunch, I had a bad feeling when my boyfriend texted me at this hour. He wanted to spend quality time with his mother, and his mother would accept me, but he was forced by her to marry someone else. My boyfriend wanted us to be apart for a while, but it was all too understandable that he wanted to break up with me. The news really shocked me, and I cried a lot. I really couldn't accept it. I felt like I had nothing left. At this point, I lost everything. I was empty-handed. I lost my job, and now I couldn't keep my lover. I didn't know how long I cried until my mind went numb and I fell asleep. I couldn't think anymore, and I slowly fell into a dream. After I fell asleep, I suddenly felt that there was another person in my room, but I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't move, and I couldn't see the stranger's face. carefully walked over to my bed and crept up step by step. Then he started to say something in my ear with a strange voice. Are you desperate? Every time he said a word, my heart broke. He continued to say, no one cares about you, no one cares about your life, even if you die. He was right. I shouldn't live anymore because when I was young, my parents wanted me to die to give birth to another brother. From childhood to adulthood, no one acknowledged me and no one liked me, not even my boyfriend. And in the 30 years of my life, I have done nothing, with no house and no car in my hand. At that point, I just wanted to end my life. That man said he would help me. He helped me out, but then he continued to whisper that he would get me free. I grabbed the rope. I looked up at the roof of my mind completely blank. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. And on the ceiling there was no place or crossbar to tie the rope. He helped me. He took my arm and I obeyed him completely. He went to the headboard and tied one end of the rope to the headboard. My heart was confused. I didn't want to bang. My body didn't listen to me. After he finished tying the rope, he turned to give it to me. I started wrapping the rope around my neck. At this point, I still didn't realize what I was doing. I leaned forward and the tight zipper pulled my neck back. I was short of breath for a moment. My tears were also flowing a lot. I rolled my eyes and my consciousness became hazy. I started to feel everything go dark in front of me. As soon as I sobered up a bit, I heard the loud knocks. The sound was far from near, from dim to clear. I had become more conscious but couldn't get rid of the rope. After a moment of sobriety, I saw the ceiling appear clear, no longer blurred. I opened my eyes. My whole body was drenched in sweat, and I found myself still lying on the bed. And it was my boyfriend who was knocking on the door. He was outside, banging on the door and screaming. I looked around the house, surprised to see no one. I felt like I just had a dream. It was a real nightmare. I climbed out of bed and went to open the door for my boyfriend. My boyfriend immediately rushed over and hugged me. He asked me to forgive him. His appearance that night saved me in my life. We then decided to get married, and his family gradually accepted me. Got a new job and also moved into his house. But one day, I read some scary news. In my old motel room, a young man committed suicide due to depression, and he also committed suicide exactly the way I dreamed about it that very night. This story originated from a hobby of mine. I love collecting antiques, and it was this hobby that got me involved in a very peculiar incident. I loved buying weird antiques. The appearance of those items also had to be very special to attract my attention. And the best place to buy these was at the antique market. It was busy there, with buyers and sellers coming in and out. I couldn't distinguish between real and fake antiques because many of the fake ones were carved very accurately. I loved going to the antique market. In addition to real and fake antiques, there were many other things such as food, clothes, etc. It was interesting to watch buyers and sellers bid against each other. I went to the antique market when I had nothing to do that day, but no antique caught my attention. When I passed a few stalls, some things placed on the ground attracted me. I had found something I liked. It seemed that the thing in front of my eyes was rare and also very strange. That item held me back. I saw a lot of skulls on the same stall, and I had never seen such strange items before. Those skulls were inlaid with silver, some inlaid with precious stones. They were all intricately carved, and they had different beauty. I also felt that these skulls were very unusual, so I sat down and looked at them. They were eye-catching, and they had been sculpted wonderfully. I picked up one and said to the owner, "Is this a real antique?" He said they were handcrafts and not antiques, but these were very rare. I wanted to buy one, so so I asked him about its price. I also thought its price would not be low because it looked very different. You will love this vase. Congratulations, it has found an owner. I was curious about what the owner said, but I liked this vase. The owner told me that this vase was imported directly from Nepal by him. The owner also told me to rest assured about its quality. After a while of bidding, I bought one at a reasonable price. I felt happy that I got such a unique item. I brought that skull home. It was probably one of the fanciest items I'd gotten my hands on until now. I added it to my collection, and the more I looked at it, the more I liked it. The vase had a beauty that made people feel a little bit of a shiver. It was kind of a combination of death and art because it looked so magical. I already had all the items I liked, and I put the vase in the most prominent place. Horrible things happened that night. I never thought it was that skull that brought me terrible nightmares. That night I went to bed as usual after a long tiring day at work. I had a strange feeling even though I was fast asleep. I felt like someone was staring at me while I was sleeping. I couldn't bear the feeling anymore, so I started looking in the direction. Then I saw something stand beside my bed. I had yet to react to what was in front of my eyes. In front of me appeared to be a very large fat man, but because it was so dark, I couldn't see clearly. My eyes continued to look upward to see that it was indeed a man. Terrified when I realized it was a man without a head, his upper body was empty. My sleepiness disappeared when I witnessed a horrible scene. I sat up in panic, a look of terror on my face. But when I sat up, the man was gone. I sat there stunned for more than 10 seconds, checking myself to see if I was awake or dreaming. I didn't think it was a dream, so I got out of the bed and wanted to go to the living room to check. As a result, there was nothing in the living room. Everything was not what I expected. I suddenly thought of the skull that I bought from the antique dealer. I thought I could see something terrible, but I didn't see anything either. That skull was still on display, with nothing out of the ordinary happening. I didn't know why I thought of that headless man related to this skull. I went back to bed and started going back to sleep, hoping I wouldn't have any more nightmares. Not long after I lay down, I felt the headless man standing next to my bed again. I didn't wake up this time. I wanted to see what he would do. That man just stood beside my bed without moving. He didn't move and I didn't dare to move. I just pretended to be asleep while laying there. And I stayed like that until the dawn and sunlight began to shine into my room. When the headless man was no longer standing on the bed, I dared to stand up. I thought the problem was with that skull, so I took a day off from the company and brought the skull to the antique market. The stall where I bought the skulls had no stalls and was not fixed in place. I asked the stall owner next door if he knew the Nepalese man selling there. That stall owner told me that the Nepal owner was taken away by the police. I thought that maybe he had committed a crime by selling a real human skull. This thought made me have to guess old and young because I didn't know how true it was. I stood there dumbfounded because I didn't know what to do. I exited the antique market and turned into a small alley nearby. I looked at the skull and wondered if it was a real skull. After thinking about it, I decided to send it to the police station. I explained everything, and the police did not come to me with it. The police jotted down a few details and said that if there was any problem, they would get back to me. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They said the Nepal owner was a smuggler of real skulls from Nepal. I had goosebumps at that time when I thought about that picture of me playing with a skull. story was a scary one that happened to my family in the early 90s when I was just a kid. At that time, my father was a truck driver. This job was quite difficult. My whole family lived off of my father's truck driving job. Sometimes, I got to go with my dad to deliver packages. I enjoyed looking at the scenery on both sides of the road. And this story happened at the end of October. At that time, the weather also became much colder. At breakfast that day, my family was eating together. My father said he had urgent business and went to town to pick up the packages. It took about 4 hours by truck from our house to the town center. It meant that my father would depart in the morning and return in the afternoon of the same day. My father started getting on the truck and drove away after breakfast that day. He seemed to be in a hurry. I also walked to school because my house was also quite close to the school. When I got home from school, the door was open. I was curious about what had happened, but it was already dark. My father should have been home by that time, but I looked around and everything was quiet. I didn't see my father's truck in the yard either. The courtyard was eerily quiet. I went into the house and asked my mother, "Mom, is Dad still coming home at this hour?" Both mother and I didn't know what was going on. At that time, no one in my house had a cell phone, so I could not contact my father. My mom and I decided to have dinner while waiting for my father to come home. But my father never came home so late, no matter how far he went. I waited until after 9 o'clock at night and still did not see my father. Both my mother and I were extremely worried about him at this time. My mother looked at her watch for a moment and began to worry about my father. I didn't know what was happening to him. I also wanted to wait until my father came home before I became too worried. But because I had to go to school the following day, my mother asked me to go to bed early. She said she would stay awake waiting for my father to come home. Entering the room, I fell asleep after a long, tiring day. I did not hear my father's truck that night. The next day, just as dawn appeared, I heard my father return. My mother's voice didn't sound right. Maybe something happened. I put on my clothes and went out to see what was happening. As I opened the door ajar and looked outside, my father looked very lost, clutching his shoulder himself and shaking violently. His whole body was haggard. His face was pale. My mother helped my father to bed and covered him with a blanket to keep him from the cold. Not until my father calmed down, my mother asked him what had happened. He said he had an experience with something very terrible and haunting. My mother and I were extremely scared when we heard his story from the previous night. My father said that his delivery went well at first. Packages were delivered to the place according to the agreed time. My father was an experienced driver, so it was not difficult to run long distances with him. But the consignee had a problem. There were no factory workers to unload during the holiday. With no other choice, my father could only wait outside for someone to unload it all. My father waited outside for hours. He was an impatient man, so eventually went inside to his security. The security guard called several times but couldn't contact anyone. My dad was in a hurry because he didn't want to drive home when it was already getting dark. He waited nearly 4 hours, and some workers came to unload the packages. But when my father returned, it was already dark. The scene outside was eerily quiet. Drivers were afraid to cross this deserted road at night. That road wasn't very empty, but many people stuck couldn't get out. My father was afraid because many drivers had encountered strange things on the road at night. He initially calculated that he could get there before dark, but his idea was delayed in the end. When my father thought he was safe past the dangerous spot, the truck suddenly shut down. His truck stopped on a stone. It was pitch black outside at that time. My father was trying to restart the truck, but to no avail. It remained motionless and did not move. But no matter how hard he turned the key, it wouldn't start. There was nothing he could do about it, so he got out of the truck to check out what was happening, but found no damage. My dad tried a few more times to start the truck, but it wouldn't work. There were no other trucks passing at that time of day and night. My father started sweating and realized that something was wrong. The temperature outside was dropping. He glanced through the truck window as if he had a premonition that something was wrong. Fog started gathering up outside. The fog made the truck windows foggy. He panicked. He knew something was wrong. His fingers began to freeze. My father didn't dare to get out of the truck. He hugged his shoulders and crouched in the car. After a while, more and more cold air rushed into the truck, making him feel cold. He saw someone walking past outside the window. As he wiped the fog off of the truck window, he wanted to call for help outside. But when he looked outside and saw people, he realized they were covered with fog up to their heads. Everyone's faces were screwed. They did not look like living people. They suddenly saw my father and rushed towards him very quickly. My father quickly pulled the truck door tight and locked it. He was so scared. People outside were trying to knock on the door to get inside. But my father was scared, and he hid in the truck and did not dare to go near the window. More and more of these people were getting closer to the truck, and they were screaming things. These ghosts were cold, constantly banging their hands on the glass window to ask to go inside. Fear surrounded my father. It was the first time he encountered such a scary thing. My dad was huddled in the truck, and it was cold. Outside the car, there were a lot of scary people watching. My dad felt like he was frozen. He thought he would freeze to death in his truck that night. Then, my dad heard someone knock on the window and call him. He opened his eyes and saw that it was a passing driver. The driver saw my father stop and not move, so he ran over to see if anything was wrong with him. And that is what saved my father's life. What was stranger than that was that the truck started up suddenly. My father returned home safely. The other man said that if my father waited a little longer, he would most likely suffer the same fate as the frozen ghosts. This story was a scary one that happened to me before. I remember that I was only 10 years old. Horror stories were completely true, and they were scarier than rumors at that time. My brother was 2 years older than me. That evening, eating dinner, the two of us sat down to play together. After playing for a while, my mother urged us to sleep because we had to go to school the following day. After listening to my mother, my brother told me to put my toys away and go to the bedroom. Our beds were separate. After my brother told me a fairy tale, we also turned off the lights and went to sleep. I quickly fell asleep. I just slept for a while, when suddenly I felt like someone was calling me. I clearly felt my grandmother's familiar figure outside the window. She was calling my name. My eyes were still closed. Sleep. But I answered my grandmother involuntarily. My answer was also unconscious, and I simply answered her call. Strangely enough, I saw my grandmother standing there, staring at me. Everything was so hazy. I tried to open my eyes, but couldn't. I humbly tried to call my brother, but I couldn't. It was like I had sleep paralysis. My brother told me to sleep because he thought I was disturbing him. He wanted to ask him to continue telling the story. At that moment, I could still hear my grandmother calling me outside. After that, the call faded away, but I still answered her. I asked if she was my grandmother.
Bro.
outside. She stood there motionless for a long time, but somehow I could see and feel her so clearly. I tried my best to turn around, but my body was still frozen, feeling heavy. My grandma's call got louder and louder. She kept calling me back to her place. The following morning, the sunlight shining through the window woke me up, accompanied by my mother's call. We need to get up for breakfast and go to school. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, remembering that last night's dream was strange and yet so real. I didn't even know if it was a dream or reality. I turned to my brother and asked him if he heard our grandmother calling outside the window last night. My brother, however, replied that no one had called except for my groans. My brother also emphasized that if my grandmother called me, she would have woken me up, so why call me for that? Besides, it was a third-floor window outside. How would grandma call out there? Then my brother left the room, leaving me with a strange suspicion. But it was truly a third-floor window. How could anyone be standing out there? This story was strange, so it could only be a dream to me. When I went downstairs for breakfast, I still had my doubts about last night's incident. I told my parents what had happened to me, but my mother assured me it was just a dream. My father, he again confirmed it was a dream because I missed my grandmother so much. My grandmother also returned home yesterday. I went to school and also accepted that it was just a dream. However, when I got home that afternoon, I learned the scary truth. As I went upstairs to my room, I saw my mom and dad doing something very confusing. My mother was holding my dad back so he could get him out the window to hang something. I saw a wooden sword suspended by a red string. Even though I was young, I still knew it was a kind of exorcism that I still saw in dramas. I was surprised to ask my parents what they were doing. Why hang that thing outside my window? My mother turned to tell me that the apartment complex was haunted and that someone had fallen to below. Maybe what I saw last night was real, not a dream. In the morning, the janitor, while cleaning, discovered a child laying motionless on the ground. He panicked and ran to find the boy still alive. This boy was from the 4th floor above my family's apartment. An ambulance quickly arrived. The boy was taken to the car in an unconscious state. Everyone was confused as to why a child would fall from the 4th floor of the apartment building. When the child's parents heard the news, they immediately quit their jobs and ran to the hospital. Fortunately, the child fell into a soft mound of soil and vegetation, so they were only soft injuries, not life-threatening at all. When he regained consciousness, the boy told his parents a scary story he had encountered. While he was sleeping in his room, he heard a familiar voice outside the window. He realized it was his grandmother's voice. Unconsciously, he sat up. Because he recognized the voice of his loved grandmother, he had no doubts that it was her. The boy dimly went to open the window and asked in surprise why his grandma was calling him at that hour. Suddenly, a scary, pale, white-eyed face appeared. At this point, the boy realized that she was not his grandmother, but some terrifying figure. The older woman grabbed his hand and pulled him to below. Everything happened so fast that it took him by surprise. By the time he woke up and realized that this was a 4th floor window and his grandmother had long since passed away, it was too late. He fell straight down. When my mother told me this, I got goosebumps. If so, did I meet the ghost last night? And did she disguise herself as my grandmother to lure me out the window? I have heard a lot about the legend of the apartment lady, but this time I did not expect to encounter anything like that. It was said that she could fake the voices and even the shapes of children's relatives and lure them to jump out of windows. Therefore, my father had to hang a wooden sword one I witnessed and which haunts me to this very day. When I was in middle school, I attended a gifted boarding school in the district. It was also the first time I had to live away from home and be independent. The dorm room I stayed in had 4 students, including one named Ben. He was eccentric, just lounging around in his room all day. Even though I asked him out to play football, he refused time and time again. He seemed to have a hard time getting along with anyone. Over time, we also became afraid of him, but he was the one who wanted to isolate himself, not because we shunned him. What was stranger was that he just liked to sleep all day. At the end of class, he would turn back to his room, climb into bed and sleep, as if sleeping was his only passion. A month later, something scary started happening to us. That night, I was sleeping when I heard strange noises. It seemed that the sound of the door opening was waking me up. I became curious and thought it must be one of the friends in the room getting up to no good in the bathroom. However, that day I still smelled the burning smell from somewhere. I sat up immediately, grabbed the flashlight from under the pillow, and shone the light around. I also asked, "Who's there?" "If you're just going to the bathroom, don't be so noisy." I shined my flashlight at Ben's place, but he was nowhere to be found. I thought it was true that he just went out to go to the toilet. My voice woke the other two. Everyone was sleeping and told me not to pay attention to what Ben was doing because he must have had a stomachache, and that was why he smelled like that. And then we didn't think much of Ben but lay down and continued to sleep. It was quite cold that night. Near morning, I suddenly woke up because I felt the need to urinate and decided to go out to the bathroom. I looked over at Ben's bed and was amazed. Ben hadn't yet come back. The door was still open. Why was he out all night? I walked out slowly. I would go to see what was wrong with Ben. This guy had a lot of weird actions, but after all, he was still my roommate. I should take care of him too, of course. As I neared the door, I suddenly heard footsteps. At this point, Ben walked in. His face looked quite tired. I called to him. "Ben, do you have diarrhea or something? No crime of eating so much, eh? Your face looks so unsightly." This time, however, Ben did not say anything. His face was like a lost soul, not responding to my words as he kept walking. It felt very strange. Normally, Ben would answer anything I asked, but that day his attitude was very strange. I did not know what was happening. As I looked at him, I realized he was walking very strange. Even when Ben climbed into bed, he did not take off his slippers. He was really eccentric. I thought of going over there to tell him to take off his sandals, but at the time, I wanted to beat, so I just ignored him. The following day, I decided to tell the story of Ben to 2 of my roommates and ask them all to see where Ben went. I assumed he was sleepwalking. As I expected that night, the door opened again. Ben walked out with a strange gait. The 3 of us were curiously watching from behind, wondering if this guy was doing something shady, or was he really sleepwalking, as I guessed. There was indeed something shady. Ben didn't go to the bathroom, but walked past. He then walked up the stairs, as his very fine. Ben continued to walk up to the 4th floor with a lost soul, then to the 5th floor. Again, our dorm room had 5 floors, and we were on the 3rd floor. Because the number of students was not that much, the 4th and 5th floors were empty. We felt curious. What was Ben doing there? Above the 5th floor was empty space, darkness, where the air was cold and the musty smell was creepy. When we got there, Ben was nowhere to be found. We felt weird, knowing that he was there. How did he disappear so fast? But just then, suddenly a girl's cry rang out at the end of the corridor, accompanied by a scary, interrupting voice. We felt chills down our spines. This place was a male dormitory, so why was there a female up here? Maybe they were ghosts. Just thinking about it, all three of us got goosebumps. We gathered courage and walked to the room at the end of the hallway. We wanted to go to where the crying was coming from. I thought that maybe Ben was hiding some scary secret. In the dim darkness, two black figures appeared by the window. They were facing the window and with their backs to us. I recognized one person as Ben, but the long-haired girl beside him, we didn't know who she was. At this point, we understood and looked at each other and smiled. It turned out that Ben was secretly dating a girlfriend in this area. We didn't expect a shy guy like Ben to have a girlfriend. As if he heard our laughter, Ben suddenly turned his face. However, the strange thing was, where was the girl standing next to him? The three of us went inside the room. I cheerfully teased Ben that he had a girlfriend and refused to introduce her to us. He secretly met up here late at night. Is that what you were doing, Ben? However, when we shone the flashlight into the room, we did not see the girlfriend. But she was just there, right there. We curiously shone the light across the room to look for her, but there was absolutely no one there. What the hell was going on? I walked over and looked out the window. Strangely enough, this was a fifth-floor area, empty of all people. Did we get dizzy just then? Ben was still standing motionless, and neither spoke nor answered our questions. I pointed my flashlight at him. It was scary that Ben's face became very strange. He was crying, and his eyes were wet. What was really strange was that the tears kept coming from his eyes. As it turned out that he was the one crying all the time. All three of us were startled when we saw Ben's scary expression. So all the noises were coming from Ben, and we didn't see any girls in the room. One of us thought that Ben was sleepwalking. He even asked if he should wake up. Before he could finish his sentence, he reached out and took Ben's shoulder. But the unexpected thing happened. Ben collapsed immediately, unconsciously. After seeing the scene in front of them, everyone was scared and quickly called for help. Then I heard from the manager again that Ben had a history of sleepwalking and had only recently gotten worse. The hospital later reported that Ben's life was not in danger, but his health was deteriorating. The strange thing was that the dormitory manager told us not to spread the scary story around. I also didn't know if Ben's sleepwalking was real, and who was that girl standing next to him. This was all story and mystery to me.
The story happened at my sister's house when my nephew was only a few months old. And the story was also the first time I heard the story of a child ghost. That night, while the whole family was sleeping, their son suddenly started crying. The cry of my nephew fainting at night made my sister's couple very worried. The baby cried all night. The baby didn't stop crying, which made my sister and her husband unable to sleep. Usually babies cry when they are hungry at night or when they are sick and tired. But that night, the baby was a little unusual because my nephew started crying for no reason. My sister made comforting milk, but the baby didn't drink it either. The boy also was not sick at all. After that, my sister tried to put the baby to sleep, but he kept crying so loudly that my sister's couple was confused and didn't know what to do. My sister could only hug and comfort the baby, hoping for him to fall asleep. The faces of my sister and her husband were listless and pale because they had not slept for several nights in a row. My sister thought that just holding the baby in her arms might work. The baby would be able to fall asleep instantly. My sister just gently patted it and sang lullabies to it all night. While the baby was asleep and no longer fussing, my sister gently placed him on the bed. The baby slept very well, like a little angel. My brother-in-law wondered why the child had been harassed at night lately, even though his son was not sick at all. My brother and sister's mood became more and more confused. My sister thought maybe the baby was scared of something else. My brother-in-law said that my sister should rest, and he would take care of the children because my sister looked very tired. If she continued like this, she would fall ill sooner or later. The baby had begun to sleep well, but my sister's couple was still worried. They still couldn't sleep peacefully. And not long after falling asleep, thinking that the child would sleep soundly until morning, suddenly the baby cried loudly again. He cried louder than before. My sister and her husband was in complete panic. The little boy cried louder and louder. So my sister and her husband took turns cuddling and comforting the baby, trying to put it to sleep. And so they continued to have sleepless nights. Although my nephew often cried at night, he played happily during the day. He was very obedient and did not bother his parents. During the day, my nephew was very lively and active. My brother-in-law called my mom to talk about their son. And my mom said she would come to my sister's house as soon as possible because my mother was also very worried about her baby grandson. My mother arranged to come over as soon as she received a call from my brother-in-law because she loved the grandson very much. No one understood her grandson better than she did because my mother had a lot of experience in taking care of children. My mother also came to look directly at her little grandson, so she looked at him in shock and exclaimed, "What happened to the child's face?" The child's face had a few red marks that weren't obvious, and they didn't know where those red marks came from. My sister also didn't know when these red spots appeared. My sister thought the baby had a rash, so she gave him medicine. But my sister herself didn't know what to do. My mother said that the baby had been bitten by a child. "It's not a rash, it's from a child's bite." My mother's words shocked everyone. My sister and brother-in-law were very scared when they heard that. Everyone in the family believed in ghost stories, and they believed in spiritual things like this. My mother said that kids who were like her grandson were the ones who easily angered the little demons. My mother bent to the ground and searched for something under the sofa to confirm her statement. My brother-in-law asked her what she was looking for because there was nothing suspicious about their house. It seemed that my brother-in-law also did not know what my mother's purpose was for doing so. My mother let my brother-in-law look under the chair. "This child not only harms your son, but also steals food." My brother saw a lot of leftovers that looked like rats eating something under the sofa. But there were no rats in the house. This time,